It is April 27, 1945. In the port of Shimonoseki, Japan's most vital shipping strait, a convoy of 7 merchant vessels prepares to depart. Loaded with food, coal, and steel, the lifeblood of an empire, the skies are clear. American submarines have not been seen in these waters for weeks. The harbor master logs the departure at 5:42 a.m. He considers it routine. He will never make another log entry. In the darkness of the previous night, 12 B-29 superfortresses had flown over this harbor at a mere 5,000 feet. Absurdly low for bombers that normally operated at 30,000. They dropped nothing that exploded. They dropped nothing that burned. They dropped objects that simply sank and waited. By 9 a.m., all 7 ships were at the bottom. What you are about to learn is the story of the most effective naval campaign in the entire Pacific War. A campaign that, by the time it ended, had destroyed more Japanese shipping tonnage than American submarines managed in the entire previous 3 years of war. A campaign that, according to Japan's own post-war testimony, broke their ability to feed their population, and accelerated the end of the war by months. And a campaign that almost no one today has ever heard of. The man responsible was General Curtis LeMay. The weapon was the humble naval mine, and the strategy was so brutally simple, so devastatingly effective, that the Japanese had no answer to it. This is the story of Operation Starvation. To understand why Operation Starvation worked, you first need to understand something fundamental about Japan that most people overlook. Japan is an island nation with almost no natural resources. No oil, no iron ore, no rubber, no coal in sufficient quantities. In 1941, Japan imported 88% of its oil, 74% of its scrap iron, and nearly all of its rubber. Every bullet fired, every aircraft flown, every warship steamed, all of it depended on a constant, uninterrupted flow of shipping through a handful of critical sea lanes. Japan's merchant fleet in 1941 was the 3rd largest in the world, at 6.3 million tons. To sustain its war economy, Japan needed a minimum of 3 million tons operational at any given time, and nearly all of that shipping flowed through a single point, the Shimonoseki Strait, 5 miles wide at its narrowest, the jugular vein of the Japanese war machine. Coal from Kyushu's mines had to pass through here to reach the steel mills of Osaka. Iron ore from Korea had to pass through here to reach the factories of Tokyo. Food from the south had to pass through here to feed the population of the north. Block this strait, and Japan would begin to suffocate. Not in weeks, in months. American planners had known about this vulnerability since 1943, but for 2 years, they had been unable to exploit it. The reason was the nature of the weapon required. Naval mines come in 2 fundamental types. Contact mines, the classic image, a steel sphere with spikes floating near the surface, are visible and relatively easy to sweep. Japan had extensive minesweeping capabilities and had become expert at clearing them from their harbors within hours. But a new generation of mines changed everything. Magnetic influence mines, pressure mines, acoustic mines. These weapons lay dormant on the harbor floor, invisible and undetectable, triggered by the magnetic field of a passing ship, or the pressure wave of its wake, or the acoustic signature of its engines. And critically, they could be set on a counter, so that they would ignore the first 10 ships to pass, then detonate on the 11th, making sweeping them almost impossibly dangerous and time-consuming. The problem was delivery. These mines were heavy, up to 2,000 pounds, and had to be placed with precision. Submarines could lay them, but slowly, expensively, and in limited quantities. Surface ships could not get close enough to Japan's home waters. Aircraft could deliver them, but the bombers of 1942 and 1943 lacked the range and payload capacity. Until the B-29. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was the most expensive weapons program in American history, more costly even than the Manhattan Project. Designed to strike Japan from bases in the Marianas, over 1,500 miles of open ocean, it had the range, the payload, and the precision to finally solve the mine delivery problem. General Curtis LeMay saw the opportunity. His superiors initially did not. Curtis LeMay, in early 1945, was already controversial. He had just ordered the firebombing of Tokyo on March 9, a raid that killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. He stripped his bombers of defensive guns and gunners to carry more incendiary bombs. He flew them low at night, against every established doctrine. His commanders thought he was reckless. His aircrews thought he was insane. The results proved him right. Tokyo was devastated far more completely than any high-altitude precision bombing mission had ever achieved. But LeMay was not satisfied. He had a map on his wall, and on that map was the Shimonoseki Strait. And he had a problem. Japan's industrial cities could be burned. But Japan's will to fight was not being broken. The military government in Tokyo, the Supreme Council for the direction of the war, showed no sign of surrender despite the destruction of city after city. LeMay understood why. The Japanese military could absorb civilian casualties. What it could not absorb was the loss of the supply chain that fed its war machine. LeMay calculated something remarkable. American submarines had been attacking Japanese shipping since December 1941. In 3 years of war, they had sunk approximately 4.9 million tons of shipping, an extraordinary achievement that crippled Japan's ability to move oil and raw materials. But the mine, delivered by aircraft in sufficient quantity to critical choke points, could potentially match that in months, not years. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. The Shimonoseki Strait handled an estimated 7,000 ship crossings per month. If that number could be reduced to 2,000, Japan's industrial machine would begin to seize. Steel production would fall. Food distribution would collapse. The war economy would implode from within, without a single American soldier setting foot on the Japanese home islands. LeMay requested permission to begin the operation on February 19, 1945. He was initially denied. The B-29s were needed for city bombing. The mines were an untested distraction. The generals who controlled LeMay's orders were skeptical of what they considered a peripheral strategy. LeMay argued, lobbied, and eventually persuaded Admiral Chester Nimitz, who understood naval logistics better than any army general, that the plan was sound. On March 20, 1945, Operation Starvation was approved. The operation began on March 27, 1945. It would run for 141 days, until Japan's surrender. In that time, LeMay's men would fly 1,529 sorties and lay 12,053 mines across 18 critical sea lanes. The operation was a masterpiece of systematic thinking. Rather than randomly mining every harbor, which would have spread the effort uselessly thin, the team had identified 18 specific sea lanes that collectively accounted for nearly all of Japan's internal maritime traffic. The mines themselves were a technological arsenal. Magnetic mines triggered by a ship's steel hull, acoustic mines triggered by engine noise, pressure mines triggered by the displacement wave of a passing vessel, and critically, combination mines that could only be triggered by 2 or more stimuli simultaneously, making countermeasures exponentially more difficult. The Japanese minesweeping service, the Sokai, had approximately 350 vessels, sophisticated, well-trained, and experienced, but they had been designed to deal with the mines of the 1940s, not this new generation of weapons. When they encountered LeMay's mines, they discovered a nightmare scenario, a mine that their equipment detected as magnetic wood, when they attempted the standard countermeasure of running an electrical cable to neutralize the magnetic field, detonate on its acoustic sensor instead. The sweepers began to be destroyed by the very mines they were trying to clear. Within 3 weeks of the operation beginning, the Shimonoseki Strait was effectively closed to Japanese shipping. The harbor master who had considered convoy departures routine now faced an impossible calculation. The cost in sweepers of keeping the channel open was approaching the value of the cargo that passed through it. Japan began to route shipping around the strait entirely, adding hundreds of miles to every voyage, burning precious fuel, slowing delivery times, and exposing ships to submarine attack for far longer periods. LeMay watched the statistics and ordered the mining extended to 17 other harbors: Kobe, Nagoya, Osaka, Yokohama. The entire industrial coastline of Japan became a minefield. The statistics that emerged from Operation Starvation are almost difficult to believe, not because they seem too small, but because they seem too large. In the first 30 days alone, 67 vessels were sunk or damaged, over 213,000 tons of shipping. By the time the operation ended, 670 ships had been destroyed, representing 1.25 million tons. To place that in context, American submarines had sunk 4.9 million tons of shipping in 3 full years of war. LeMay's mines destroyed 1.25 million tons in 141 days, and the B-29 crews flying these missions suffered a loss rate of just 1.3%, compared to 6.2% for city bombing missions. Mining was not only more effective, it was safer for the men who executed it. The Joint Target Group, the Allied intelligence body analyzing Japan's economic capacity, began to receive intercepts that told a story of unraveling. A report dated June 15, 1945 noted that Japan's steel production had fallen to 26% of its 1944 peak. Aircraft engine production was at 40%. The reason, the report concluded, was not the bombing of factories. It was the inability to deliver raw materials to those factories. The mines were winning, but here the story takes a darker turn. Japan in 1945 was an island that grew enough food to feed perhaps 60% of its population. The remainder, rice from Korea, soybeans from Manchuria, fish from the southern seas, depended entirely on the merchant marine. When that merchant marine was destroyed, it was not just steel mills that went hungry. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese government was projecting a food deficit of 4 million tons for the coming year. Rations for civilians had already been cut to approximately 1,600 calories per day in the cities, the minimum for light physical activity. In rural areas they were lower. Children were being sent to the countryside in mass evacuations, partly to escape the bombing, but partly because food was slightly more available away from the cities. The mines did not discriminate between military cargo and food. A ship carrying rice from Korea was just as dead as a ship carrying aviation fuel from Sumatra. The collapse of Japan's shipping network was total, and its consequences fell first and hardest on the civilian population. This was not an accident or a side effect that planners failed to anticipate. The stated objective of Operation Starvation, as written in its operational directive, was to reduce Japan's ability to support the war through destruction of the merchant marine and disruption of internal distribution. Internal distribution included food. LeMay knew, his planners knew, and they proceeded. The response of the Japanese Navy was a case study in the limits of institutional adaptation under pressure. Vice Admiral Koshiro Okawa, commanding the mine defense forces, understood the threat clearly. His reports to Tokyo were increasingly desperate. He needed more sweepers, more time, more technology. Tokyo gave him some of what he requested. Emergency sweeper construction was accelerated. New countermeasure techniques were developed and tested. A system of using wooden boats, non-magnetic and therefore less vulnerable to magnetic mines, was proposed and partially implemented. It was all too little, too late. The fundamental problem was that LeMay was laying mines faster than Japan could sweep them. In a single night, a squadron of 40 B-29s could lay enough mines to occupy Japan's entire sweeping force for a week. And while the sweepers were focused on one harbor, LeMay would mine 3 others. The psychological effect on Japanese merchant mariners was perhaps equally devastating. To sail into a known minefield, knowing that the next ship in your convoy might simply cease to exist without warning, required a level of courage that even Japan's fanatically disciplined naval culture struggled to sustain. Desertion rates among merchant crews, not naval personnel, but civilian contract sailors, began to climb. Harbor masters reported ships anchored in supposedly safe waters, their crews refusing to proceed. The Shimonoseki Strait, Japan's jugular, was bleeding out. History remembers the end of the Pacific War through 2 images: the atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this is not wrong. Those weapons were decisive, shattering events that fundamentally altered Japan's calculation about whether resistance was even conceptually possible. But the historical record of Japan's surrender deliberations contains something that is rarely taught in schools. In the sessions of the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War in the summer of 1945, the six-man council of military and civilian leaders who debated surrender, the atomic bombs were not the only catastrophe being discussed. Alongside the nuclear devastation, council members raised the collapse of the supply chain, the starvation of cities, the paralysis of industry. General Korechika Anami, the army minister and the most powerful voice against surrender, knew that his army could still fight. His infantry divisions remained intact. His soldiers remained willing to die. But in July 1945, he had received a report from the Army's logistics department that told him something he had never previously faced. The Army could not be fed through the coming winter, not because of enemy ground operations, not because of atomic bombs, because Japan's ships were gone. Operation Starvation had done something that years of submarine warfare and months of city bombing had failed to achieve. It had reached through Japan's military strength and struck at the basic biological requirements of survival. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The formal surrender was signed September 2. In the subsequent United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the systematic post-war analysis of what actually worked, mining was rated as the single most economical and effective form of attack conducted against Japan during the entire war. The report concluded that mining of the Shimonoseki Strait and other sea areas was the most effective means of reducing Japanese imports, causing greater disruption per bomb drop than any other form of aerial attack. Per bomb dropped, more effective than firebombing, more effective than precision bombing, more effective than anything except the weapons that ended the war. Curtis LeMay went on to become Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. He ran for Vice President in 1968. He is remembered as the architect of the Strategic Air Command, the father of modern American air power, and depending on your perspective, either a genius of strategic bombing or a man responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. He is almost never remembered as the man who won the naval war against Japan. The men of the 313th Bombardment Wing, the B-29 unit that flew the majority of Operation Starvation's 1,529 sorties, received no special commendation. Their commanding officer gave a press conference after the war that drew almost no attention. His men had flown through searchlights and flak over some of the most heavily defended waters in the world, at altitudes that made them easy targets, and had dropped weapons that required far more precise navigation than conventional bombs. They had, according to the post-war survey, saved more American lives than any other single operation conducted in the Pacific, because every ship they sank was a ship that could not have carried fuel, ammunition, or reinforcements to the Japanese soldiers awaiting the planned invasion of the home islands, an invasion projected to cost between 250,000 and 1 million American lives. Their names are not on war memorials. Their operation has no major monument. The strategy that likely saved more American lives than any other in the Pacific is a footnote in most histories of the war. This is the cost of invisibility. Starvation is a slow death. Ships that never sailed carry no dramatic newsreel footage. The industrial collapse of a nation from within does not produce the images that become iconic. Operation Starvation produced none of those images. It produced empty harbors, anchored ships, and famished cities, and it won the war. The moral question that Operation Starvation poses is not the same as the one posed by the atomic bombs, which at least had the clarity of deliberate, targeted acts of mass destruction. The mining campaign is more insidious precisely because of its indirection. No mine was dropped with the primary intention of starving children. The intention was to destroy shipping. The starvation was, in the clinical language of military planners, anticipated collateral damage. The mines killed sailors and ships. The starvation was a downstream consequence of the ships not arriving. Does that distinction matter morally? The men who made the decision understood what would happen. The operational directive said so explicitly. The intelligence reports quantified the projected food shortfall. LeMay was not ignorant of what he was doing to Japan's civilian food supply. He proceeded because he believed, and the evidence strongly supports, that it would end the war faster, saving both American and Japanese lives in the long run. The calculus of total war, accept a certain number of civilian deaths now to prevent a larger number of military and civilian deaths later. It is the same calculation that justified the atomic bombs. It is the same calculation that justified the firebombing of Tokyo. And it is the same calculation that makes the history of World War II, upon close examination, deeply uncomfortable for anyone who approaches it with moral seriousness. Operation Starvation worked. Japan surrendered. The invasion never came. The projected 1 million American casualties of Operation Downfall never materialized. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers who would have died in that invasion survived to go home. But 10 million Japanese civilians faced starvation in the winter of 1945 to 1946. Not all of them experienced it, because the war ended first. But they faced it, and the mines in Japan's harbors were a significant reason why. History rarely offers us clean heroes. What it offers us, if we look carefully enough, is the truth. Operation Starvation was brilliant. Operation Starvation was brutal. And it was the secret weapon that nobody remembers, that may have done more to end the Pacific War than anything except the atomic bomb itself. Today, the Shimonoseki Strait is one of the busiest shipping lanes in Asia. Thousands of vessels pass through each month. There is no monument to the men who mined it. There is no museum dedicated to Operation Starvation. The 12,053 mines that LeMay's men dropped were swept from the waters in the months after Japan's surrender, and the sea returned to its ordinary business. But beneath the surface of that ordinary business lies the ghost of what happened here in the spring and summer of 1945, when the most effective naval campaign in the history of air warfare was fought not with guns or bombs, but with patience, precision, and the quiet, implacable physics of an object resting on a harbor floor, waiting. If this story surprised you, if you had never heard of Operation Starvation before today, then share it. Because the stories that shape our understanding of history are often not the loudest ones. Sometimes, they are the silent ones, like a mine, sitting in the dark, waiting to be found.